Have you ever woken up to find something in your home that shouldn't be there? Something small, something off. A door slightly ajar, a picture frame tilted, a note you don't remember writing. Most of us shrug it off, don't we? Blame it on a bad memory. But sometimes the explanation isn't so simple. Sometimes it's something far more disturbing. Tonight, we're diving into the story of Ethan, a man whose quiet, predictable life unraveled in the most terrifying way. What started with a simple letter spiraled into a nightmare of guilt, regret, and something that refused to let go. Stay close, because this is the endless apology. And remember, once you hear this story, you might start to question the small things you notice in your own life. Are they really nothing? Or is someone trying to remind you of something you've forgotten? Welcome to the Abyss Chronicles. Let's begin. Ethan's life was nothing special. In fact, it was painfully ordinary. He woke up at the same time every day, brewed his coffee, went to his unremarkable job, and came home to his small, quiet apartment. Predictable, simple, and Ethan liked it that way. But one morning, something changed. It was a Monday, and Ethan was moving through his usual routine, half asleep, waiting for his coffee to finish brewing. That's when he noticed it, a folded piece of paper sitting on the kitchen counter. His first thought was that it was a grocery list or maybe a receipt he'd forgotten about. But as he picked it up and unfolded it, his heart skipped a beat. The note wasn't a list or a reminder. It was a single sentence written in his own handwriting. I'm sorry for what I did. I never meant for things to go that far. Ethan stared at it, his mind racing. The handwriting was undeniably his, every curve and stroke familiar. But he didn't remember writing this. He didn't even know what it meant. He read the note again, trying to make sense of it. What I did. What had he done? For a moment, he wondered if this was some kind of prank. Maybe one of his friends had written it to mess with him, but no one else had a key to his apartment. And the more he looked at the note, the more uneasy he felt. Still, he convinced himself it was nothing. He crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. Weird, he muttered to himself. Probably just me being forgetful. But as he sipped his coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He went through the rest of his day trying to forget about the note. By the time he got home, he had almost succeeded. Almost. That night, Ethan climbed into bed, determined to put the strange morning behind him. But sleep didn't come easily. The words from the note echoed in his mind. He found himself wondering what it was apologizing for. I'm sorry for what I did. I never meant for things to go that far. What had gone too far? And why couldn't he let it go? Ethan woke up the next morning, groggy and still uneasy from the strange note he'd found the day before. As he shuffled out of bed and reached for his phone on the nightstand, something caught his eye. Another note. It was folded neatly, placed right next to his alarm clock. His breath caught in his throat as he reached for it, his fingers trembling. Slowly, he unfolded the paper, and there it was again, his own handwriting. I know you hate me. I hate me too. Please forgive me. Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't written this. He knew he hadn't. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the words, trying to make sense of what was happening. His first instinct was to check the apartment. Someone had to be doing this. He rushed through every room, flinging open closets, checking under furniture, even pulling back the shower curtain. Nothing. All the doors were locked. The windows were shut tight. He stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the note, his heart pounding. Okay, he muttered to himself, trying to stay calm. Maybe I wrote it and forgot. I've been stressed. That's all this is. But deep down, Ethan knew he didn't believe that. The day dragged on, and Ethan couldn't focus on anything. His mind kept drifting back to the note on his nightstand. When he got home that evening, he felt a twinge of dread as he stepped through the door. His eyes immediately scanned the apartment. Everything looked normal. Relieved, he laughed at himself for being so paranoid. "You're losing it, Ethan," he muttered. But the relief didn't last long. The next morning, there was another note. This time it was sitting on the bathroom sink, waiting for him like it had been placed there intentionally. He picked it up with shaking hands, his stomach churning as he read the words. "I still see their faces. The blood. I never wanted it to happen like that." Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The words were more vivid now, more specific. And worse, they felt personal. He couldn't explain it, but the emotions in the note felt like his own. He tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him, suffocating. Ethan spent the rest of the day in a fog, barely able to function. When he got home, he went straight to the trash can and dug out the first note he'd thrown away. He laid them all out on the coffee table, comparing the handwriting. Every single one was an exact match. His handwriting, his words. But they weren't his. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He stayed up with every light in the apartment turned on, jumping at every creak and shadow. When the sun finally came up, he found himself hoping, praying that this nightmare was over. But of course it wasn't. The notes kept coming every day, always left somewhere he couldn't miss. His wallet, his coat pocket, even tucked into the box of cereal in his kitchen. They grew darker, describing horrifying things in graphic detail. Screams, blood, the cold weight of a knife. Each one made Ethan feel sicker than the last. By now, he was sure of one thing. Someone, or something, was doing this to him. And whatever it was, it wanted him to remember something. But what? Ethan's life had become a waking nightmare. Every day the notes were there, waiting for him, growing darker and more specific. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything but the creeping sense of dread that now lived with him. And then came the photograph. It was a cold, gray morning. Ethan was on his way out, his hands fumbling to lock his apartment door when he opened his mailbox. Inside, there was no junk mail, no bills, just a plain white envelope with no return address. His heart sank. He already knew what it was. He ripped it open and pulled out a single photograph. It was him, sitting in a dark room at a wooden table. His head was down, his shoulders slumped, and in his hand, he was holding a knife, a long blade, glinting faintly in the dim light. The worst part? The knife was smeared with blood. Ethan dropped the photograph like it had burned him. He stumbled back, nearly falling over. His head was spinning. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The photo couldn't be real. It couldn't. He didn't recognize the room. He didn't recognize the table. He didn't even own a knife like that. But there was no denying it. That was him in the photo. For the rest of the day, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. How could someone have taken that picture? And why couldn't he remember it? His mind kept circling the same terrifying question. What if it wasn't fake? That night, Ethan sat in the middle of his living room, every light in the apartment on. He held the photo in his hand, staring at it, searching for any clue, any explanation that might make sense. His phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. He jumped, nearly dropping the photograph. It was 3 a.m. The number was blocked. His thumb hovered over the screen. Every instinct told him not to answer, but something else. Curiosity? Fear forced him to press the button. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaking. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice. A woman's voice, soft and trembling. "You don't remember me, do you?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His fingers tightened around the phone. "Who is this?" he demanded, though his voice was barely a whisper. The woman didn't answer right away. When she spoke again, her voice cracked, heavy with sorrow. "You promised you'd never forget me," she said. "But you did." Ethan froze. His blood ran cold. "Who are you?" he stammered. "What are you talking about?" The line went dead. Ethan sat there for a long time, the phone still pressed to his ear. The silence in the apartment felt deafening, like the walls were closing in on him. He didn't know who she was. He didn't remember making any promises. But deep down in the pit of his stomach, he felt it. A gnawing, terrible certainty that she was telling the truth. Ethan didn't leave his apartment for days. He barely ate, barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the photograph. Every time he thought he was alone, he remembered the voice on the phone, soft, broken, accusing. He tried to distract himself, watching mindless TV and scrolling aimlessly through his phone. But no matter what he did, the feeling wouldn't go away. That feeling that something was watching him, waiting. And then it happened. It was late at night, and Ethan was pacing his living room, running his hands through his hair, muttering to himself. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to leave. He didn't know where he would go. Anywhere was better than here. He grabbed a duffel bag and started shoving clothes into it. But as he walked toward the front door, he froze. There was something on the floor. Another letter. It wasn't folded this time. It was lying flat, right in front of the door, like it was blocking his way out. Ethan hesitated, his hands shaking as he bent down to pick it up. The handwriting was the same, his handwriting. But this note was different, longer. I remember now. Do you? As soon as he finished reading, his head exploded with pain. He stumbled back, clutching his temples, as memories, horrible memories, came flooding in all at once. He was in the woods. The air was cold, the ground damp beneath his feet. There was a girl there. She was crying. Her name was Lily. I don't want to do this, he remembered saying. But in his memory, his hand held a knife. Lily was begging, her voice breaking as she sobbed. Please, she said, you don't have to do this. But he had done it. The knife cut through flesh, and Lily's screams turned into gurgles. Warm blood splattered onto his hands, dripping onto the dirt. Her body fell, lifeless, into the leaves. Ethan staggered back, gasping for air. He couldn't believe it. He didn't believe it. No, he whispered to himself. No, that wasn't me. I didn't. But the memory was too vivid, too real. The lights in his apartment flickered. Then, the room was plunged into darkness. You promised, a voice whispered behind him. Ethan spun around, his heart pounding. His breath caught in his throat as he saw her. Lily. Her throat was slashed, her pale skin stained with blood. Her lifeless eyes stared at him, but her lips were moving. You promised you'd never forget me, she said, her voice low and cold. Ethan stumbled backward, his legs trembling. I didn't mean to, he stammered. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. But Lily's expression didn't change. Her face twisted into something cruel, almost inhuman. You don't get to be sorry, she said. She reached out, her hand cold and ghostly, and pressed it against his chest. Pain shot through his body, unlike anything he'd ever felt before. His vision blurred, and the room around him seemed to melt away. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was somewhere else. The air was cold, the ground damp beneath him. He blinked, trying to adjust to the dim light filtering through the trees. He was in the woods. The knife was in his hand. Ethan's heart sank. He looked down at the blade, its cold steel glinting faintly, and felt his breath quicken. The weight of it in his hand was horrifyingly familiar. He tried to drop it, but his fingers wouldn't release their grip. Then he heard it. A voice. Please, it said, trembling and broken. Ethan turned, and there she was. Lily. She was alive this time, standing a few feet away from him, her eyes wide with terror. Tears streamed down her face as she backed away, shaking her head. You don't have to do this, she begged. Please, Ethan, don't. "No," Ethan whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no, I don't want this." But his body didn't listen. His feet moved toward her, his hand raising the knife. "Stop!" he screamed, but the words only echoed in his mind. Lily tripped, falling onto the damp ground. She raised her hands in front of her, trying to shield herself. "Please," she sobbed. "I'm begging you." Ethan's arm came down. The knife sliced through flesh. Blood sprayed across his hands, warm and sticky. Lily's screams turned to gurgles, then silence. Her body went limp, her wide, terrified eyes staring up at nothing. Ethan dropped the knife and staggered back, trembling. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." But as he stood there, gasping for air, the world around him seemed to shift. The trees darkened, the air grew colder, and he felt himself being pulled away. When he opened his eyes again, he was back at the start. The woods, the knife in his hand. Lily standing a few feet away, crying and begging for her life. "No," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. But it happened again, and again, and again. Each time, it played out exactly the same. No matter how hard he tried to stop himself, no matter how much he screamed or pleaded, his body moved on its own. The knife always found her, and Lily always died, her blood soaking into the ground. Ethan didn't know how long he had been trapped in the loop. Days? Weeks? Years? Each time it restarted, his guilt grew heavier, crushing him. He begged for it to stop, but no one was listening. Back in the real world, neighbors started complaining about strange noises coming from Ethan's apartment. They heard screams, sobbing, and sometimes muffled laughter late at night. Eventually, the landlord entered to check on him. He found Ethan curled in the corner of his living room, clutching a stack of blood-stained letters. His eyes were wide and vacant, his lips moving as he whispered the same words over and over. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But it didn't matter how many times he apologized. Lily wasn't listening, and she never would. And that's the story of the endless apology, a chilling reminder that some mistakes don't just haunt you, they consume you. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more terrifying tales, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Abyss Chronicles, and turn on notifications so you never miss a trip into the shadows. Because here in the Abyss, the stories never stop, and neither do the screams.